Rizwana Hamid, the Director of the Centre for Media Monitoring, and I'll be your host for the evening. As you know, Centre for Media Monitoring launched its new report today, British Media's Coverage of Muslims and Islam, 2018 to 2020. And we're here to discuss some of the findings and what they mean for journalists as well as Muslim communities. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And before I introduce the panelists, sorry, I'd like to give Zara Mohammed, the youngest and the first female Secretary General of the Muslim Council, just the platform to say a few words. Thank you, Zara.
Thank you so much, Rizwana, and thank you to all of our esteemed guests and of course the Centre for Media Monitoring for such an incredible landmark piece of work today. 10 months ago, my life changed, and I guess the first people that I really spoke to were journalists, 9 of them in a day, and I featured quite heavily across their publications, mainly for the positive, but a couple on the negative too. So I think today is really an important occasion, not just to be angry at the media or to hold them to account, but also to really value the power of journalism and the power of those stories and the impact that has on our everyday lives. And I know, notably in my 10 months, that has been really highlighted by media who have projected my vision, the work that we've been doing as the MCB. But what today is really about is a publication looking at, I guess, the consequences of both the negativity of some of that journalism and stereotyping of Muslim communities and British Muslims in Islam, but also the importance of bringing so many different journalists and media outlets together to discuss how do we move forward. So really I commend the team behind this. They put in countless hours right up until this moment, and I'm sure they won't be breathing and relaxing till this event is over, but also to all the incredible journalists that have joined us tonight and this evening, and to all of you. I really hope that this report will be a tool for all of us to think about how we can move forward and improve the representation of British Muslim communities, and also think and take heed, I guess, of the impact that our words can have on everyday people. So thank you, Rizwan. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the panel and some of the discussions this evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Zara, for your continued support and encouragement. I'd just like to bring on Miqdad Versi, who is the founder of CFMM and the lead strategist. Miqdad.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, when we started this, the first and probably most important part of this discussion and where the Centre for Media Monitoring came from was me engaging with the Mail on Sunday and the managing editor of the Mail on Sunday. A simple complaint because I had an issue, I had a concern about an article, led to a meeting with the Mail on Sunday managing editor. From then, I've engaged with the Daily Mail's managing editor. We've all engaged with the Daily Mail's managing editor, or at the time, Alex Bannister, with Gary Jones at the Express, with Paul Clarkson at the Sun at the time, and Keith Paul, and obviously now with Alison and here Emma. And what our approach has been is many have complained about the state of affairs when it comes to reporting of Islam Muslims. And rightly so, there have been many issues as have been chronicled here, but we wanted to make sure that we could engage constructively, see what we can do to make things better. Because if we can't talk about these things, we may not agree, but at least we can engage and make things better. And the key question that was kept on being asked is, you say there's a big issue, well, prove it. Well, this report hopefully will act as a real strong evidence base. It's very difficult for anyone to say, having looked at 48,000 articles, 5,000 clips, and analyzed them ourselves to come to conclusions about what we thought about bias, that this does not represent a monumental and a chronicling of the scale of the issue at hand. So our constructive approach is all to make the reporting of Islam and Muslims better, and hopefully this is an important step in that direction. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Emma and Alison in particular as well. And that's on the broadcast, that's on the print side, and also on the broadcast side. Mark, it's great to see you there, and Inzi as well, and many others. And I'm sorry I didn't mention the stream as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Miqdad, for your vision in setting up Centre for Media Monitoring and your endless energy and commitment to improving the reporting of Muslims and Islam. I'd briefly like to introduce all the panelists. We have Faisal Hanif, who is Centre for Media Monitoring's analyst and the author of the report. Alison Phillips, who is the editor-in-chief of The Mirror and the first female editor of The Mirror, followed by Emma Tucker, who's also the first female editor of the Sunday Times and former deputy editor of the Times. Nasreen Malik, who's the Guardian's columnist and feature writer. Mark Easton, who is the BBC's Home Affairs editor. Inzi Rashid, sorry Inzi, is it Inzamam or Inzi? I know you like to be called both, so I'll call you Inzi. Okay, who's Sky's North of England correspondent. And we have our guest speakers, Brian Cathcart and Professor John Homewood, who are academics and who've written extensively on how Muslims and Islam are covered in the media. And last but not least, we have Wajid Iqbal, who was a victim of inaccurate reporting, and we'll see later how that impacted his life. And I think at the end of the day, that's the hard face of it, the impact that any kind of inaccurate or misleading reporting can have on individuals and how it impacts on their lives. Before we get started, I'd like to ask the audience, the chat function is there. Please, if you have any questions, and we will put the questions to the panelists at the end, we've saved some time, put them in the Q&A box. The chat function is there to chat, but please do be courteous to other audience members as well as to panelists, and hopefully we'll make this a very kind of constructive discussion amongst everyone. I'd like to start very briefly. Initially, I'd just like to say that Emma Tucker, the editor of the Sunday Times, unfortunately can only be with us for 20 minutes. So I am going to focus initially, after I've spoken to Faisal, on Emma, just because she has to leave, but then I will come to everybody else. Faisal, just briefly, a short recap of what the main findings are, because obviously members of the audience won't have had time to read the report. So a short recap of what the main findings are. And as someone who for the past 3 years has literally monitored the media night and day, you know, what your observations are beyond the findings of this report. Over to you, Faisal.
Yeah, thanks, Rizwana. Let me echo Miqdad's words and also extend my thanks to all the panelists, particularly Alison and Emma for their forewords and kind words in sort of, you know, acknowledging the report and the evidence base, and particularly to Emma, because people might not know this, but she was responsible for giving me my first big break within journalism when I was a reporter at the Times, and it was a really eye-opening experience for me, and a really great experience. Actually, I had a great time there. Everyone there was really nice to me, so I'm glad she you know, recommended the report, and I'm glad she's joined us. So, I mean, when I started this work, it sort of built up on the stuff Miqdad had been doing on his own for a long time. And what I wanted to do was something that was large in scale and different to what had already been done. There'd been academic studies by people who, in different universities, who'd looked at the issue of the representation of Muslims in the British media. And I approached some of them. One of them, I think, is joined us tonight, Professor Paul Baker, who helped a lot in developing the methodology. And what it allowed me to do was just take a broad sweep of the media, as opposed to, I mean, everybody sort of complains about the individual article that's really bad. It doesn't need a Center for Media Monitoring to do that. But what I thought I could do is, you know, look at this thing in sort of totality. What is going on here? And what are the things we can pick out? And what that methodology has allowed me to do is that it's allowed us to establish certain findings, but also go beyond that and see where these issues are coming from. So if I give you one of the findings, for example, you know, one of the things that's been reported today is that almost 60% of stories have a negative aspect and behavior within them of a Muslim individual or Muslim organization. Now, somebody can look at that and think, well, I mean, the news has a negative bent anyway. So why is that so surprising? Is that so surprising? We didn't discriminate in terms of any articles. We had so many keywords. So even the passing mentions were included. And given that they're all included, 60% is quite a high figure. Okay, so you've got 60% of negative aspects and behaviors. What then? Well, where is this stuff coming from? One of the things we found is that some of the publishers who exceeded that 60% were the Wires, Reuters, AFP, AP, I believe. I'll have to recheck that, but it was the wire agencies. So what we can establish is actually a lot of these sort of negative stories where Muslim characters or Muslim organizations are presented in this way are coming from sort of the initial source, the wire agencies. And that tells us that actually some of these things are editorial decisions. And to give you another example of that, if you look at, for example, what is taking place in India at the moment against Muslim populations, almost on a daily basis, you can find incidents from villages, towns, cities, where Muslims are being lynched, they're being humiliated, etc. Hardly any of those appear in wire agencies. But if you go to Muslim countries, so the smallest incident you will find in wire agencies. And you have to say, well, why is that discrepancy? Why have they chosen that story as opposed to that story? Those are editorial decisions. So that's something that our sort of methodology has allowed us to find. There's other things, for example, misrepresentation. A lot is, the highest number of misrepresentations come from sort of right-leaning publications. Not overly surprising, but what do we mean by misrepresentations? Some of these things are sort of minor, and it may be a sort of issue about they've not quite understood a theological concept, etc., etc. But in the case of Waj, who we'll hear from later, and others, there's examples in the report where some of these things are majorly bad. There's people who they've libeled to the extent where people have lost years of their life, have had to go to court, have eventually received an apology and damages. So there's a whole scale of this stuff, and most of those, again, the really bad ones, come from sort of right-leaning newspapers. So we've identified an issue, where the issue sort of comes from. So those are a couple of the findings in the sort of online section. When you go to broadcasters, for example, national broadcasters have more sort of negative stories as opposed to regional. Well, yeah, of course, again, that's pretty obvious because the national news, it deals with sort of what it considers as more sort of important issues and sort of international issues, etc. Whereas regional news has the sort of room to feature incidents like, for example, what Waj went through, or Islamophobic incidents on the streets. So you get, that's a kind of obvious finding. But one of the things we were able to establish with our generalizations metric was sort of tropes, where, tropes against Muslims and Muslim communities. And you see from the broadcasts, a lot of those end up in the fictional representation of Muslims. So drama was the genre which sort of had the highest number of negative aspects and behaviors, I believe, and misrepresentation. Again, I'll have to go back and check that. It's been so long since I sort of dealt with it. But so again, we were able to establish where the issue lies, what's behind this issue, and what people can look at these and think, okay, maybe this is an area we can improve in terms of our representation of Muslims. And sorry, your second question was, you have to remind me.
You know what, I'll come back to the second question because I'm very aware that Emma's going to be leaving us soon. So I'll come back to the second question. But Emma, if I can turn to you, what for you are the main lessons do you think that the press, print media, can specifically take away from this report?
Thanks, Rizu, and thanks, Faisal, as well, for your nice introduction there. And hello, everyone. I think the main lessons are that the main lessons that I took from this report are that it's really important for us to listen to people right across society, and that we need to continue to report matters impartially. I think a very key lesson is that our coverage of Islam, like our coverage of anything, is going to be subject to highly critical scrutiny from intelligent and well-informed readers from right across the spectrum, and that we will be, we will always be held to account under the law, but also under the editor's code, if we get things wrong, which we would expect. I think it also shows that for us as editors, the press, it's important for us to listen and to engage, but it's also important for us to remain independent and to take our own view of what we see, what we hear, to remind ourselves that it's really important to listen and engage, but we're not going to be beholden to any sector of society if we're going to truly be doing our jobs well. I think I'm a relatively new editor, and I would say that this report, which is interesting, reinforces how I approach my job, and that is to really have very, very high expectations of my reporters. And I expect them to cover a broad range of issues. I expect them to have a diversity of thought. I want them to avoid groupthink on issues. I expect accuracy. I want lots of ideas. I'm trying very hard to promote the idea of constructive news. I mean, Faisal made the point that, you know, news by its nature tends to be very negative, but we find people want to engage with something a bit more constructive. And I think all of those things, none of those things would exclude any sectors of society at all.
Thank you. And Sir Alan Moses, when he departed from his role as chair of IPSO, said that he felt Muslims were reported on in a way that no other community would be, and certainly not Jews or Catholics. Is this something that you would echo? If not, then why not? And if yes, why is this the case?
I actually don't echo that at all. I think it may have been true in the past, but you know, the country's, as with so many things, the country's changing. I think there's been a lot of consciousness raising. I think we're all more aware of things, and I think, you know, I think there's been religion as an issue has come to the fore right across the country. I mean, when I was growing up, I don't think anyone talked about religion, but it has become one of the big issues of the last decade or so, and you know, therefore, it's generated a lot of news stories. The overwhelming majority of which I would add from your own report found not to be biased, but it has shown up all these stories, and it's our job. And you know, and I think the way Muslims in this country have become more outspoken is a reflection of that, and that's a good thing. But it's our job to report it fairly, and I think we've learned through this process.
But when you see, I mean, I understand you're saying that you think, you know, people are far more conscious, but we still get day in, day out, and we monitor the media day in, day out. We're seeing misleading headlines, we're seeing inaccuracy, we're seeing uncorroborated facts, we're seeing unreliable sources. I mean, is that good enough for journalists?
Well, I hope, you know, I would really hope that you wouldn't see that in my newspaper. And, you know, if we make mistakes, we correct them, we abide by the law, we abide by the editor's code. I think, you know, the country is engaging with these issues in a much more honest and open way than perhaps it did in the past. And I think it's our job to report that as fairly and neutrally. But I think it is also fair to say that these are often very detailed and complex matters. And one thing that I can say, you know, absolutely sincerely, is we don't come at this with any sort of agenda. We don't sit down, we haven't got an agenda. We are here to, you know, bring high quality reporting, and that's what, you know, we're tasked with. We don't have an agenda, we're not seeking to push one, you know, and so yeah, I think that's our job, and that's what we try to do. And we will make mistakes, you know, everybody does. We report, and Sunday Times is a massive enterprise. It publishes thousands of words every Sunday. But as I say, you know, we are committed to abiding by the editor's code, and if we make mistakes, we'll correct them.
And if you say that you know, people don't have an agenda, would you accept that there's possibly ignorance, there's possibly unconscious bias? And if so, you know, what, since you've become editor of the Sunday Times, are you doing to kind of combat this? Well,
that's a good question, and I'll tell you what we're doing to combat it. I think consciously we are aiming to make our newsroom more diverse. I think all newsrooms are doing that because they're, you know, we're all aware of our need to reflect society. And so that's something that we're all very consciously engaged with here. But that isn't to say that we're going to sidestep stories that are awkward or shy away from stories that might be deemed controversial. But so we want to uphold the values of independent reporting, but also to make sure that we are reflecting and that we've got a newsroom. I mean, our younger reporters are much more engaged with these issues than some of the older reporters. So, you know, we listen to them. I instill good values in them, I hope. I certainly have very high expectations of them. So I think, I just think it's, generally speaking, as we're not always getting it right, but as a nation, we are all talking about these issues much more openly.
I know a lot of people talk about, you know, diversity and inclusion and bringing in more journalists, but when you speak to journalists from Black, Asian and other kind of minority backgrounds, they say that once they're in there, there's still this kind of newsroom culture, there's kind of peer pressure, and so the output is not necessarily reflective of the diversity within, so the perspectives are no different. So how do you change that?
Well, I think it's what I've said. You as I said to you before, you know, I don't want anything to be off limits. We have a lot of open dialogue in our newsroom. I want people to come forward with ideas. I don't want to sidestep controversy. And I don't, but equally, I want them to, you know, I want us as a newsroom to challenge received wisdom about ideas. And I really hope that if you asked any of the reporters here, they would say that they felt they were able to raise things. You know, certainly with me and with my deputy, we're very open-minded. And you know, we don't want to take things off the agenda. Hello?
No, sorry, my battery suddenly. Fault. Sorry, I didn't have my plugged in. Carry on. Sorry about that.
No, so I was just going to say, you know, as far as I'm concerned, my job is to report the news. I don't have an agenda. Nothing's off the table. I'm open to ideas, and I really hope. I mean, it's interesting what you say, but I hope that the younger reporters in our newsroom don't feel in any way sort of subject to a sort of way of doing things. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be a bit of muscle memory in a newsroom, but we're constantly challenging that. And you know, as I said, I want my journalists to approach things in a constructive way, not always to sort of repeat things that have gone in the past. I want to challenge groupthink around ideas and to have a diversity of opinion, a diversity of thought, and you know, to really try and be as open-minded about the way we cover the country as we can, as you know, and that's, I hope, what we're doing.
I know you've got to go. Just one last question. Do you think there is enough religious literacy, media literacy, enough ethical journalism around today, given all the competition, you know, that news outlets face, the kind of need for more audiences and clickbait, and you know, is there room for high standards of journalism still?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think definitely there is. I actually think the more kind of madness there is on social media, the more dubious news or news of low quality that's out there, is the greater the opportunity, or the stronger the responsibility that we have as sort of, you know, sort of trusted legacy news brands to deliver the news to deliver really high quality news. So I think in a way it makes us more responsible, because we have to be different, we have to be trustworthy. You have to be able to come, and if you read a story in the Sunday Times, you have to be confident that that is a correct version of events. Because I think with everything that's going on in social media, the sort of dubious sourcing of stories, you know, the mission for trusted brands is all the greater.
I know you don't want to talk about your sister paper, The Times, and it will be something that we will discuss because we've covered it in the report, but I will address that with Brian Cathcart. But thank you, Emma, for your time.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to leave.
Joining.
Okay,
no
thanks.
Thank you. Nasreen, I'd like to come to you quickly in terms of what your thoughts are about the report.
Thanks, Rizwana. I mean, the report it's a tremendous amount of work, and it's incredibly useful to have data to back up what I think we all know, either via anecdotal evidence or just being around, really, the past few years. What I think was interesting in the report is that the percentage does not seem that high. So there is a way that this report can be misread, in that you can say, well, it's only 7% or it's only 14%. These are not overwhelming figures. We're not saying, you know, 97% of coverage of Muslims is negative, but it doesn't have to be for it to be impactful, because you have to also put it in the context of what is the quantum of the overall coverage about Muslims in the British press. I think that's a very important point that we need to be mindful of, that we shouldn't situate these negative stories in what Emma just said, you know, thousands and thousands of words and lots of copy and lots of reporting about the world in general. It's about the specific coverage that Muslims receive and how much of that is attention grabbing, because then the percentages becomes sort of moot. All that is relevant is how impactful, how attention grabbing, how much these stories contribute to stereotypes, how much they either demotivate or put off Muslims or non-Muslims from Muslims. So I think there is a kind of data element of it, which is really important, and you can take it and you can show it to people, you can show it to editors, you can use it as evidence. We also need to understand that the percentages themselves are not enough for us to understand the scale of the problem and the quantum of the problem, in the sense that it is the majority of high impact stories about Muslims as opposed to a minority of overall stories about Muslims.
Yeah. And you wrote in one article on the right-wing press or right-leaning press, any puzzlement about intolerance in this country needs to start not with vox pops on the street or in the football stands, but with questions about the bad faith actors in our media who fuel bigotry and the good faith ones who in their responses unwittingly perpetuate it. What do you mean by this?
Well, I mean that when we talk about coverage of Muslims or Islam in the media, or just in general, we tend to generalize the problem, right? We tend to call it, societal Islamophobia. We tend to try and lump it in with immigration, when these things are relevant, with racism, with responses to terrorism. And I think that there is a risk when we do that we divert attention from what is, as you know, it seems like a pretty concerted, persistent campaign that has been ongoing for a long period of time. And when you try and get your head around, when you try and talk to people, when you try and point to stories, the responses you get are, well, there's no coordinated effort. No one's sitting in a room with the rest of the editors saying, how are we going to vilify Muslims today? But that doesn't change the fact that the end result is that. So we need to figure out, before we talk about people's attitudes on the streets, before we talk about Islamophobia, before we talk about hate crime, as with any sort of kind of endemic prejudice in British society, against immigrants, against marginalized people, against people on benefits, any of these characters the British press pummels on a regular basis, we need to understand how people's attitudes are informed by a sort of mood music that is there all the time. And to understand where that comes from, we need to have these conversations, and we need to be able to understand where the kind of editorial decision-making comes from. Because it's not all an accident, right? It's not all just, well, we picked it up from the wires, and then by the time it was published, it became clear that something wasn't true. When things happen, when there's a pattern of these things happening, there is a protagonist behind them. And what I'm really struggling with, I constantly struggle with in these conversations, is the deprotagonization of journalism and the press. In general, when it comes to Muslim coverage, it's like this famous phrase, like there's racism but no racists, right? So there's Islamophobia, but absolutely no Islamophobes. There is someone somewhere making this decision in a way that is not unconscious bias, in a way that's not muscle memory of newsrooms, and we need to figure out where that comes from and make those people take responsibility for it. I think we're going to constantly come up against this sort of loosey-goosey, well, it wasn't my decision, and we have diversity of thought and diversity of opinion, and nobody's sitting there doing it deliberately, is that we forget, or we tend to accept this excuse that there is absolutely no bad faith anywhere. You do not get these kinds of stories constantly without there being some bad faith anywhere. It's not polite to say that. It's not part of the sort of protocol of British journalism and how to have these conversations, that you point these fingers, but we have to have them, because otherwise we're just going to go around in circles.
And following on from that, just briefly, I mean, you've been very critical of the lack of outrage amongst journalists themselves when stories on British Muslims have been deliberately fabricated. Why won't more people in the trade speak out?
That's a very good question. I think there's a few answers to that. The first answer is that it's not, there's nothing in it for you. There's nothing in it for you to back Muslims or to go up against powerful institutions or powerful journalists and call them out. There's just there's going to be no profit for you in that, number one. And number two, I think there is a lot of internalized prejudice against Muslims that makes you think, well, even if this particular story isn't true, something I come across a lot is there's a sense that, well, even if this particular story is untrue or it's egregious, there is a sort of general concern about Muslims, is there not? So we're also coming up against a sort of liberal, non-right-wing prejudice against Muslims that receives these stories with less offense and less outrage than they should, because there is a general belief that we need to be talking about our concerns about Muslims, and we won't let these few wrong stories or these few badly placed news items chill us from having these conversations. And that's a line you hear a lot, which is that Islamophobia is a fiction that is used to shut down debate, which is something that was published in the Times by Annie Phillips. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that people genuinely do believe that even if there has been coverage about Muslims that is unfair, about Islam that is unfair, that is not an excuse to stop talking about Muslims or Islam in ways that question shibboleths or raise concerns that Muslims are not allowing them to raise. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that there is much more latent, benign isn't the word, but sort of latent, unquestioned liberal prejudice against Muslims that is the kind of firmament that all these stories land in.
Thank you. Alison, you've provided a foreword to the report, and you've been very honest in there in terms of saying that, you know, as an industry and as journalists, we need to question ourselves in terms of the reporting of Muslims in Islam. What did you take from the report, and would you take issue with anything in the report?
I think, well, I think you can look at the report and you can think, have we made, as an industry, have we made progress? And that, you know, are we in a better place than we were at one point? And then you can look at the report and actually think, I think as Nesrin was just saying, what an awful long distance we still have to go, and that there is so many areas that the other thing that's really difficult is that obviously we talk about the industry as one homogenous industry, and it's not. It's much more complex than that. So you have some areas where there is people have really taken a long, hard look at themselves and look at how they're covering stories and have got more robust measures in place to make sure that things don't go wrong so frequently. And then you've got other areas of the industry where that really isn't the case. And I think that's where it's slightly tricky, because there's all sorts of, for all sorts of different reasons, as well as Nesrin was saying, that we've got some people might have concerns about things that they feel that they're writing. That's perfectly legitimate to write that. Other people, it might be an unconscious sort of, some kind of unconscious bias that they're promoting. Other people just may not be doing so many stories in that field. So it's not quite that clear, but I think there is a general pressure on the media generally now, which is growing with every passing month, to understand that it has to be far more accountable than I think it ever has been in the past. That I think that's from both a commercial perspective, and also I think in terms of, you know, the basics of advertisers that are requesting this and readers are requesting this. And I think those that are going to survive into the future are going to have to be far more open and transparent about their decision making and their account. There's going to be just general greater accountability. So I think there does seem to be some progress, but I do think when you read that report as well, that there are still problems that haven't been addressed, and that we're not, that there just are.
And you, as an editor, I mean, you've made a concerted effort to try and make improvements at the Mirror. We work closely with you on the Mirror advisory group, and yet obviously we're still complaining, whether it's, you know, inaccurate headlines, whether it's kind of uncorroborated facts that are reported. Why is the will at the top not trickling down either to journalists or sub-editors, who ultimately obviously are responsible for some of the content as well as the headlines? What is needed for that will at the top to trickle down and to be put into effect?
So I don't think it's enough for any editor just to say, I want this to happen, and then to just think that it's magically going to happen, because that isn't. You've got to be consciously going out there and making sure that it does trickle down. So I would say, I mean, I don't know whether you've got any comparative data, but if you just used us, for example, on the Mirror, I would say we're in a much better place than we were. I mean, I would say that if you came in about another year's time, if there was some data from, say, the last year, that's even greater, because we are now proactively, we have monthly sessions with all staff where we discuss anything that has, so obviously we pick up things as they happen, and if there's a mistake or there's somebody's got something wrong, we will change it there and then. But beyond that, because I think talking to Nesrine's point is about, we need people thinking in the right way from the beginning. So we have monthly sessions where we talk about our approach to different stories, our approach to general methods of reporting, our approach around style and headlines and language. And that is a kind of, because that's what you need to change the culture, because I think this is the point. It's already very well talking about stuff, but unless you're going to get to the deep roots of the culture and how you change that. And the other point of that being, of course, that you have a newsroom whereby anyone feels empowered to say anything at any point that they feel isn't right and shouldn't be there. So we've done a lot of work on that, so that we feel that everyone, and you've also got, and I know, you know, as I think someone else said earlier, there's an awful lot of talk around diversity and inclusion and getting Muslim people or Black people into a newsroom. But the point is, you've got to get to a point where you have almost like that tipping point. So you've got enough people that they are feeling empowered to speak, and then you've got a culture where those people are being listened to as well. So it's all part of a much bigger process, because it's not enough just to get sort of a few more Muslims in the newsroom. You've got to change the culture of all the people in that newsroom, and that, you know, I'm not making any excuses for anybody, but that's really difficult. Changing cultures in any organisation is difficult. Changing cultures in newsrooms, I think, feels like it's doubly difficult, because there's such machines that have operated in such a way for so many years, that you have to kind of almost unpick a lot of that kind of thinking from somebody's first day on a weekly newspaper or whatever. There are certain ways of doing things that are kind of ingrained into people. It's almost like children learning to speak. There's such ingrained habits, and this is a story because X, Y, and Z thing has happened. Therefore, I write X thing first, then I do Y and a little bit of Z at the bottom. It's so deeply ingrained in people. And if you're going to try and unpick that without your entire news operation collapsing in the same way because everyone forgets how to write a news story, you've got to really dig deep, and that's going to take time. It's a lot easier sometimes, I think, I was going to say it's easier with new people coming in, but in the same way, it's not necessary as well, because they pick up the culture that exists. So you've got to unpick that culture before the new beginners can get it right as well. And that's really time consuming and really difficult. But I think if we're serious about making change in our newsrooms, I mean, it's across the industry, that is kind of where you've got to get to.
Thank you. Mark and Inzi, obviously you're obviously Mark, the Home Affairs editor, but also you report, and Inzi, you're on the road reporting as well. Kind of on the home front, and particularly in recourse to British Muslims, what are the challenges you or your colleagues have faced when reporting on Muslims or Islam in general? Mark, I'll come to you first.
If I could just say, first of all, that I think this report is really useful. I think for the BBC, and I'm sure this is true for many newsrooms, you know, we do need to be challenged. We do need to be reminded or have it explained how our journalism affects obviously individuals, but also the way that it affects wider communities. And I think what's been interesting about the last couple of years the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, during the pandemic. And maybe it was the coincidence of those two things that made it so powerful. But I think what that did, certainly at the BBC, was made us stop in rather the same way as I was suggesting your report did. Just hold on, how are we doing here? How good are we? I mean, the BBC's values and principles, you will know them well. I mean, we like to think we're good at this stuff, and we care deeply about it. We talk about it all the time. But actually, how good are we? And I think that with the Black Lives Matter campaign, what that prompted us to do was work even harder to try and understand the world through somebody else's eyes, which is actually really hard to do. Or not somebody else, through sort of a particular community's eyes. How does our news coverage look to a Muslim in Glasgow or in London or in Torquay? What do they make of the way we cover Britain? I was thinking about, what is the purpose of BBC News? And I think that Emma was saying, or perhaps it was Alison was saying that, actually there's a variety of different kinds of news, and we shouldn't just imagine that we're one great big homogenous mass. So the BBC, bless them, they have a primary purpose for BBC News. It's in the charter, so it's pretty important to us. And essentially, it says that we need to help people understand and engage with the world around them. And the key word, I think, is understand. And I think that when it comes to understanding, this is when you're thinking about understanding in terms of an individual story. And I think we've been talking both about the specific and the general here, but in an individual story, sometimes it's actually really important to know that one of the key players is a Muslim. It is actually important to know that, because it helps explain what's going on. It may not be comfortable for other Muslims, but it is actually important, and we need to say it. But in the general, we need to be thinking really hard about what the overall impact of our coverage is, the whole digest, as it were, of stories that we do, the balance that we give things. Because if we're searching for understanding, if we're searching for truth, actually, if you overstate certain kinds of story, and news sort of does this all the time, if you overstate certain kind of stories, actually what you do is you paint a dishonest picture of the world. I mean, I know this particularly in relation to crime, say. News loves crimes. We cover, our bulletins for a time were just replete with stories of murders and knife crime and violent court cases, and anyone who watched that news could be forgiven for thinking that Britain was becoming an increasingly violent place, when actually the reality, as we know from the best evidence, is that your chances of being a victim of violent crime today are actually probably lower than they've ever been in history. So we have to be careful not to be dishonest. And I think that plays to your point about how the wider Muslim diaspora, and I can see people on there saying, well, there's lots of different Muslim communities. Let's not. I take that point, but people who describe themselves as Muslims, many of them from different backgrounds, will say that they do feel the impact of the kind of coverage that your report reflects, and we need to think about that. And particularly the BBC right now. We are thinking very hard about what we call hard to reach and underserved audiences. Partly the BLM stuff I was talking about earlier, I think it sort of is part of that. And therefore, we do need to take account of everything that you're saying in your report. I'm not going to say I agree with all your methodology or even necessarily all your conclusions, but I do think that there are things that we need to listen to carefully, take away and think about because obviously the BBC, different from many other news outlets because of the license, we have to be something that is accessible and meaningful to people from every background and every age and every group. So, that's really important, and we can't miss anybody out. And, British Muslims are a key part of that too. So if we're not getting that right, then we need to work harder at it.
I think a lot of British communities would feel unrepresented by the BBC, given that it is a public service broadcaster and is supposed to be catering for their, needs as well. And one of the things people normally say is that, Muslims are only spoken about in terms of extremism, terrorism, negative stories, or are only brought on, when it's an issue to do with religion, Islam. There's no normalization of bringing on a geneticist or a geologist or an economist or, anyone else to present Muslims as any other citizens. That's one step, that's one way. But also in terms of even when there are so-called positive stories, there's normally an underlying kind of tone there of saying, oh, this is despite of, or they're exceptionalized in some way, so a Somali boxer will be kind of like exceptionalized, even though it's a positive story. It's somehow saying, oh, well, Muslims don't normally do these kind of things, and there's a lot more of that kind of coverage where people think it's positive, but actually it's still pandering to this exceptionalism, and Muslims are somehow different from everyone else. And how do you respond to that, and how do you tackle that?
Well, I think this is difficult. I think Alison said it was difficult, and I'm sure Emma would say it was difficult. There are lots of issues here. One of the issues is about whether or not we use the descriptor Muslim in our coverage at all. As I said earlier, I would argue that in covering Islamist terrorism, actually the Muslim is an important descriptor in understanding the potential motivations of those involved in that attack, and therefore it is relevant. But if we're interviewing a very successful female businesswoman, entrepreneur, who happens to be Muslim, should we insert the word Muslim into our coverage? Because people would say, well, why would you mention that? You wouldn't mention that, Alan Sugar is, I don't know what he is, but a Christian or an atheist or anything else. So I think there's an issue, there's a difficulty here that we kind of take a view that you shouldn't actually mention somebody's faith or ethnicity, or unless it's sort of relevant to the story, and that relevance is important, actually, because if you don't have that, then actually you risk all the problems that you're worried about. In fact, I noticed on the Q&A, someone was saying, well, why don't you just not say that this particular bomber was a Muslim? Well, I think in that case you do need to say it, because you need to understand the motivation and the drive behind this person. But you don't need to know that somebody who is a brilliant shoemaker in wherever is a Muslim. You don't need to know that. So I'd be interested to know from you whether you think we should be saying that.
I think a lot of people would take issue with that, because in our research we've found that the kind of Muslim identifier, of the religion itself is very much used in negative stories. But when you get something that shows Islam or Muslims in a good light, the religion isn't mentioned, and that is problematic because it's very skewed. But also in terms of Islamism, you were talking about in the terms Islamist, one of the biggest problems we've found is that it's a blanket statement that is used for democratically elected, governments, to, kind of extremists, down to children demanding halal food in France, being labeled as kind of veering towards Islamism. So I think terms, language, how you identify people, when you don't identify people, they are important. And if you disproportionately are identifying a group consistently with negative stories, and what Nesrin was talking about, that this kind of underlying narrative that's there, then that does become problematic. And I think the communities would find that problematic. Yeah.
Well, we do. I mean, just to come back on that, I mean, we do I've been home editor at the BBC since 2004. So, I've seen, and I was Home and Social Affairs editor at Channel 4 before that. So I have, followed this debate from way back. And, I've seen the huge amount of discussion and conversation about the language that we should use, when we should use, how we should describe those people whose perverted sense of their Muslim faith leads them to commit atrocities. How do we report that in a way that is true to what is going on, but at the same time does not sort of misrepresent a whole community? And that, I suppose, is that's the difficulty. I think that your report is excellent, and I was glad to see that you sort of proposing some solutions at the end. But I think this is the beginning of the conversation, a way beginning of the conversation. We've been talking about this for a long time, and we must continue to do that with people like yourselves and others, trying to think how we negotiate the language of this, because it is really hard to be clear and not use language which is going to end up being seen in a particular derogatory way. So clarity, if you're going for understanding, going back to the primary purpose of the BBC, if we're going for understanding, then clarity is the key. And the difficulty is that if you start, you say, oh, we can't use this word, you can't, actually you end up not doing what you should be doing.
Lindsay, I'd like to come to you. In terms of just expanding on Islamism and terminology and the words and language that people use, I think another thing that Faisal has found in his research is that often certain voices within the Muslim community are amplified, other voices are not given a platform or are silenced, but also in terms of the broader Muslim population and scholars, for example, who would condemn, extremists, terrorists, etc., their voices are not heard, but instead those who are kind of on the fringe and marginal are almost amplified, so that the kind of image that's left behind is that all Muslims are these extremists.
Yeah, look, I think it's difficult in the sense that when you, as broadcasters, when an incident occurs and we all jump to our contact list and we kind of see who's in the address book, right, let's go and get that person on air, let's get that person on air. I think often those are people who have put their neck above the water, with their head above the water, and said that they'll come on and speak. And I think it's when you get more Muslims, be it reporters, producers, editors, whatever it is, whether you get more Muslims in the newsroom, they bring their book of contacts to the table, and that enables that pool of contact to open up, that pool of different voices in order to give different views on a particular story. And I think that's hugely important, that you don't keep jumping back to that same person who always comes up and speaks whenever there is some form of incident. I think one important thing on wording, and I think it is very difficult for people like Mark, for myself, my other colleagues who are on air as well, is getting that wording right, because one slip up and you've lost trust of a lot of people. And when we're talking about Islam and terror attacks and motivations and thing, and just even reading some of the comments, it's so clear that there is a massive distrust with the media when we're talking about very sensitive things. Islam is not the motivation for a terror attack. Those Muslims who carry out terror attacks are not Muslims. And I think, it's hugely important that we kind of we highlight that, and we don't just brandish people who say they come from a Muslim background who've carried out this terror attack as just saying, he was a Muslim bomber or she was a Muslim bomber or whatever. We have to highlight the fact that they believe they've done it in the faith of Islam, but Islam does not teach that at all. And I think that's hugely important, but it is a difficult task. It isn't easy. And I think things are changing. One thing that Alison pointed out, which I think is important, is that there has been change. And I think people at the top are listening, particularly my, just over 3 years that I've been at Sky, conversations that I've had with people very senior in the newsroom have potentially maybe never had conversations like that before. And I think bringing people in, like myself and some other colleagues who have come in over the last 3 years and have been, ballsy enough essentially to have those conversations with editors, I think is hugely important. And I think listening and information like this report, it's a thorough report, it's detailed. It doesn't just highlight what the wide scale issue is, it also highlights where actually good things are going on, which outlets are actually reporting things well. And that's hugely important as well. I think we need to give credit where credit is due. And I think the report does that. But listening and taking action are the big steps. And I am seeing that change, particularly at the organization that I work. I think Sky has worked hard with its colleagues and with its staff, particularly over the last couple of years. And I think they continue to do some powerful, no agenda journalism and just tell the story what's on the ground. And essentially that's our role at the end of the day, just tell the story.
I mean, we do have obviously quite a few examples from Sky, whether it's the Pledge, whether it's the Press Review, opinion-based programs that don't fare too well either, and where, people from the far right are given a platform.
We got rid of
they go unchallenged, and there isn't the kind of religious literacy there on the part of the presenters, and the producers or the researchers haven't done their job to equip them with that information. And a lot of that is happening. What do you, somebody who works for that organization, what do you do in a situation like that when you come across reports that you think, fall below standards?
When things fall below standards, we pick it up and we address it with our bosses. Look, I'll give an example. And there was an incident a couple of weeks ago where Sky made a mistake, and I won't go into details of what happened, but Sky had made a mistake, and it was flagged at the time by a number of colleagues, and we went straight to the top. We spoke straight to the top. A day later, after they had discussions within senior management, they came back to us and told us that they made a mistake. That day, they put in specific action plans in order to make sure nothing like that happened next time. And they were robust action plans as well. And I felt confident. I felt confident in my employer that, okay, next time round, I know this won't happen. Someone who was crying in the bathroom on the phone to me saying that I can't, listen to this every single hour. And, I will know that next time she will feel safe and she will feel happy in the newsroom that we've addressed, a situation correctly. So, they are listening. And when there are issues, we flag them. The Pledge, for example, we don't have that program anymore. It isn't around. I don't particularly know the reasons why. But when mistakes happen, they are challenged. And from what I've seen, action is taken.
Thank you. Professor John Holmwood, I'd like to bring you in here because obviously you've kind of studied the coverage of Muslims and Islam, and also wrote a book about the so-called Trojan horse incident. Can you kind of shed some light from your perspective in how Muslims are framed, and especially when it comes to topics such as education specifically? What have you learned and what can you share with us?
Yes, I think it's very important to see. I think the point that Nesrine Malik made right at the start about how there's a kind of convergence between right-wing and liberal reporting, and it happens in a conjunction where there is a problem of the factual reporting then facilitates the continuity of a particular kind of commentary based upon the misstated facts. So it was very clear in the Birmingham Trojan horse affair about a supposed Islamic plot to take over schools that in the unfolding of the story, no question was asked about how schools could be taken over. So a simple factual question, how would that take place? It could only take place under the authority and auspices of the Department for Education as part of its academies program, and it could only involve a highly successful school acting as a sponsor to extend its successful practices into other schools. And all of that will be present within minutes and memos associated with the Department for Education. So the question is, well, why did that not come out? And in a sense, why is it still not out over some 7 years since it took place? It was also an occasion when the issue of religion was misrepresented within schools. So it was a very strong feature of the press. And this is where, if you like, the liberal media, which is hostile to religious education, promoted the idea that there is a thing called a secular school compared to a faith school. But there is no secular school. All schools are required to have compulsory religious education and compulsory worship. So in that context, the school was acting lawfully. It may be the case that a lot of schools where parents don't have religious interests and concerns allow those practices to fall into disuse, but a school whose parents are interested in what the law requires and also see that as facilitating their own engagement with the school, then that should have been reported properly. So that becomes the story which misrepresents education, but at the same time presents Muslims as in some way acting both unlawfully in relation to other schools, aggressive takeover, and also acting to introduce undue religion into schools. It became an incredibly important story because it was the basis of the government's introduction of the duty to promote fundamental British values, the 2015 Prevent safeguarding duty on schools and other bodies. So it's an incredibly important story to have got right. Now scroll a little forward, and what happens is a particular community also gets pathologized there, the community of Alum Rock in Birmingham, a poor community with an unbelievably successful school, which should have been celebrated, but actually gets presented negatively. So now we have the LGBTQ parent protests. Just take the example of the No Outsiders program at Parkfield Primary School in Birmingham. That was widely presented as being about sex and relationships education in the context of new legislation coming into the school. It was, in fact, the way the school taught fundamental British values as part of Prevent. That was not reported in the press, and nor was reported in the press that the school was one of 4 schools in a multi-academy trust. 2 of the schools Muslim majority schools, 2 of the schools white majority schools. All 4 schools have the same duty to promote fundamental British values. 2 schools taught that duty through the No Outsiders program. The other 2 schools didn't. And it's easy to see that it's the Muslim majority schools that had the No Outsider program promoted towards them. So that's, that becomes part of the process. Now it becomes, because the story in a sense is continuing, BBC Radio 4 did a program, The Corrections, 3 programs on the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair. Episode 2 was organized around a story of a phone hacking of a girl's phone in the school, which purported to show a relationship with a boy at the school and put her at risk of honor-based violence. So a very profound way of presenting the story came from Andrew Gilligan in 2014. It's reported, repeated again in 2020, and yet that story is false. It's false in the sense that it doesn't appear in any of the official reports about the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair, and yet is the only example of an illegal action apparently done by the school. And the programme is edited to make it appear as if Ian Kershaw is responding to a question about that episode, and yet that episode doesn't appear in his report. The BBC.
I mean, is it willful neglect?
I think there is a serious question to ask the BBC about it, because I raised the issue with them. Well, I can show to you that this is false, and false in many of the details, that the safeguarding lead at the school was not a Muslim, but a white atheist male, that the phone hacking case, what the school identified as the issue was an example of sexting, which would have been regarded as sexting of one of the most serious categories, which 2 years after it took place should or would have been reported to the police, and that the school reported it to the police. Obviously, the police can't comment on reports, but the BBC could have fact-checked that story. It was enough that somebody made the claim about the story, and 6 years later, the story is repeated. And then, and I say the same thing because when one then looks at other stories, so then in The Observer, there becomes a story where Nick Cohen earlier this year frames a story about the problem of vaccine uptake in Alum Rock, Birmingham. It could be a story about a disadvantaged community not getting access to vaccines and so on. But it becomes a story about a theocratic regime in Birmingham that would rather uphold religious beliefs against science. And there's no basis for
very much vilified.
Yes,
very much vilified as
a liberal. That's a liberal reporter, as Nasrin was suggesting.
At this point, I'd just like to bring in Wajid Iqbal, because obviously, he's been directly at the brunt of not only misreporting, but inaccurate reporting. He won a libel case against the Mail on Sunday. And Wajid, it's kind of an understatement to say that your life was shattered as a result of it. Can you kind of just recount the experiences of having been, accused? And I'll just say very quickly that Wajid was accused. He worked in a council office, and he was accused of being a fixer for cab drivers in Rochdale who were committing crimes against young girls and giving them favors in terms of providing them with licenses. What was the experience like?
Good evening, everyone. Just want to say a big thank you to yourself, Rizwana, and also Faisal for giving me the opportunity to share my story and experience. Sorry, I'm just, what was the question again? Sorry.
No, just what did you go through? In terms of when you saw that in the papers and the repercussions and the consequences thereafter.
I mean, in terms of this story that was published by the Mail on Sunday back in 2017, before it came out, the reporter had been trying to contact me to get me to make some sort of comment. Obviously, I declined because I was employed by the local authority, and any media inquiries have to go through the media unit. So I did report it to the union and the media unit at the council I worked. I subsequently went on holiday, come back, and there was a voicemail message from the reporter, David Rose, saying that he's running the story I didn't think much of it. Thought it's just going to be a general report about the council. Early hours of that particular morning, I came home from a part-time role I was doing and just went on the Daily Mail app online on my phone and scrolled down, and there was a picture of myself, and read the article. I was just in complete shock. You know, I didn't expect my name and my picture to be published, and the lies that were published with it. I was very tearful. I'm a partner. Woke up and just, she was like, you know, what's up? What did you know? I said, look, I couldn't really speak. I've just passed the phone over to her, and she couldn't believe it. And then I couldn't sleep, and then went to the newspaper shop just down the road and bought the paper, seeing it was a double-page spread. And that was just like, you think, what am I going to do? It's a national newspaper. Who do I turn to? So, I mean, for the next 24 hours, I was just panicking. I spoke with my union and colleagues and ex-colleagues who started giving me advice. I spoke with family as well, and they said, you know, I didn't know much about defamation. So my brother guided me towards that, saying you can take them to court.
You did win your libel.
I did, yeah. I mean,
but what were the consequences for you, if you can kind of give a sense to people of the consequences of this kind of reporting?
Yeah, within a month of that newspaper article coming out, my permanent contract with the council, you know, it was just terminated out of the blue without any notice. Well, it was 24 hours notice. So obviously taking them to tribunal for unfair dismissal, you only get a maximum of 1 year's salary. So it was like losing your job straight away within a month. I was going through marital problems with my ex-wife prior to this article coming out. My ex-wife had seen it and said, you can't see the kids because of the negative publicity of, obviously, her friends, their husbands were taxi drivers. Obviously, within the community, they were talking. Within my immediate community, people sniggering away, you know, even when you go Friday prayers, people are looking at you and they're laughing at you. My eldest son was at university and he was studying policing, and fellow students there, obviously, and quite a few, because when I was working part-time, I was in Preston as a bouncer or door supervisor. So obviously a lot of students knew I was his dad. So obviously now with his picture in the press as well, he started getting to, you know, from fellow students, and he said, you know, people are saying, look, your dad's dodgy, you know, giving badges to paedophiles. So he was just getting, you know, getting it left, right, and centre. And he was, Dad, I'm just leaving university. I said, look, don't let them win. If I'm going to fight it, you know, you can too. Eventually, I mean, he did leave that particular course that summer, and I had to change course because obviously the students within his own course, you know, it got too much for him. But obviously, me not seeing my kids for 2 years. I mean, BBC asked me yesterday the amount that was given. Do you think it was enough? So there is no amount of money that can cover that 2 years I missed with my kids. You know, even if you give me £1 million, I'm not going to get my 2 years back with the kids, because you know, they were teenagers, and we did a lot of activities together, like go and watch watching Liverpool, at Anfield, because we're all Liverpool fans, going bowling or cinema. I couldn't do that, for 2 years, not even phone contact. Because the ex-wife, I understand in a way, it was difficult because she didn't want anyone turn up, because she said, look, you might get some lunatic who might find out he's got some kids or, wife, and attack the house, because it does happen. So it affected my life immensely. But luckily,
money doesn't compensate for that.
No, it doesn't. There's no amount of money that can compensate for the 2 years, or in total, should I say, the 3 years it affected me.
And do you think the money that you were paid out and the apology that you were given, did that redress the balance in terms of the apology and where it appeared? Did people take that away and see you as an innocent man thereafter?
In terms of the money, all right, it's a figure. But, how do you come to that figure? That's down to the solicitors and barristers. It's difficult to put a figure on, and you can't get anything.
The apology, do you think the apology was sufficient in terms of where it appeared in the newspaper and what people took away after having read the original story?
No, the apology, everyone will know when it comes to apologies by newspapers, it's normally chucked on page 30 odd, probably got a couple of lines thrown in at the bottom. Who's going to read that? No one. The apology, even to this day, which I've raised since the settlement, that at the start of the proceedings, the solicitors and barristers said, you've been targeted because you're a Muslim and of Pakistani origin, right? And this was put in the court papers, the statement of particulars at the start. Mail on Sunday, associated newspapers have always denied that I ever raised it, or my solicitors raised it. I have even given that particular paper to the BBC yesterday when I've done this interview. And obviously that's not been mentioned, or it's not been mentioned previously as well, when I've taken the evidence that the reason Mail on Sunday or associated newspapers targeted me was because I was Muslim and of Pakistani origin. The reason, Mail on Sunday, I keep on saying Mail on Sunday, just associated newspapers, they've apologised. But how I see it is they don't really mean it. It's just a case they had to apologise, which my solicitor asked for. And it's, they've just been found out. So they just wanted to limit on how much of an apology they wanted to make. If, associated newspapers came up and said, look, we hold our hands up and we did target you because of your religion and of your race, I'd accept it. But they don't. And I don't think any media outlets will go and do that. Prior to my case, you've seen other cases might not be similar, in relation to race or religion, might be something else. The apologies, they'll chuck it on page 20 off, and it's only a couple of lines. For me, that's nothing. That's not proper apology.
Wajid, I'd like to bring Brian in here, because Brian, this is just one case. Sorry, you've been waiting very patiently there. But this is quite widespread, isn't it? You've done extensive research.
I think there's a dimension to what we're discussing that, if you'll forgive me, is less likely to emerge from the extraordinary and extraordinarily valuable quantitative work that you do, and that is entailed in this report, and the kind of work that I do and others do, examining particular cases and researching and investigating the backgrounds and so forth. And I think So I'm thinking now of work I did on the reporting of Andrew Norfolk for the Times newspaper. So this is the chief investigative reporter of the Times. I won't go through it in detail, but with working with another veteran journalist, Paddy French, we looked very closely at his work. 3 particular stories that he ran, each story running over several days, starting on the front page and often continuing on the front page, causing big national scandals, all involving Muslims, all of them unfounded. And we looked closely at his method, the technique by which he omitted significant facts, which he, well, if he didn't know them, it's mind-boggling. Omitting significant facts, which would have completely altered the reader's interpretation of the event, or burying important information at the very bottom of the story, often after the turn to the inside page. So, you know, it's way down there, a fraction of the readers at the top of the story getting the kind of sensation and scandal will see that stuff. His methods seem to me to be to fly in the face of, you know, decency in journalism in a shocking way. We went through very carefully those stories. We exposed, as it were, the failings. That's not inadvertent. It's not accidental. This is happening because these stories are consistently presenting Muslims as threatening, particularly threatening to women. And of course, Norfolk's reputation was built on his work exposing what he called Asian or Muslim grooming gangs, a trope that is now discredited by the Home Office itself, by Priti Patel's Home Office. This is a man with a long record, and you can't defend this as accidental. You can't defend it as unwitting. This is hostility on a grand scale. And it goes further than that. It's not just being mean to Muslims. Actually, if you look at more recent work by Norfolk, or you look at one of the stories that we dealt with, there is a deliberate effort, and it's not, well, I'll develop that. There's a deliberate effort to silence, isolate, rob Muslims of support, to weaken Muslims in the face of the journalism. So what do I mean by that? I mean that supporting organizations are attacked. One of the stories we looked at was about an organization called Just Yorkshire, a human rights organization supporting Muslims in Rotherham, a place where they seriously needed support. It was destroyed. By the time they had essentially cleared their name, that there was nothing left. They were defunded. Now this happens a lot. One of the stories that you look at actually in the report involves a man called Sultan Chowdhury, who was associated with a bank called Al Rayyan. Now the libel against Mr. Chowdhury was a piece of shockingly casual, sloppy journalism, and rightly called out and rightly apologized for and paid for. But what they were really up to, what Norfolk and his colleagues were really up to in chasing Mr. Chowdhury was Al Rayyan, which was a bank used by many Muslim charities in the UK. Now, charities are, we know that the charity has a special place in the Muslim world. Charities are a very important support network for Muslims. Charities are communities and you know, focal centers. But this is an attempt to disrupt their funding, to make it harder for them to bank, which makes it harder for them to operate, particularly for them to operate internationally, which a great many of them want to do. Now, that's not an accident. This is trying to make sure that Muslims have nobody to speak for them. They have nobody to act for them. They have no means of sharing their experiences. It's seriously malicious. Now, to push that a little further, this is not just Andrew Norfolk. This is the Times newspaper. everything that was challenged about Norfolk's work was defended, not in detail because they can't defend it in detail, but it was defended in forthright terms by the Times. Any criticism was simply dismissed as a smear. So this is not just Norfolk, it is the Times, it is the editor, John Witherow, it is malicious, it is anti-Muslim, and there is nothing to stop it.
You're saying that's an agenda. Is that seen, I mean, that agenda, is that exclusive to the Times? Is it more widespread than that? Where else do you see it?
I mean, I've certainly witnessed a lot of that kind of activity, perhaps not performed with the same flagrant, sometimes flagrant kind of abusive journalism that Norfolk has displayed. But for me, the sin here is, and Nesreen spoke about this, is the failure of other journalists across the industry to disown it. Now, when we produced this unmasked report about Norfolk, we circulated the hard copies. You can read it online, but we circulated the hard copies, hundreds of copies, to leading journalists across print and broadcast. I mean, basically everybody whose name we could think of. We circulated it to all of them. I can tell you that not one word was written by any journalist working in a major national publication. I think there was something in one of the religious papers, but not one word. The collective silence, and that's just a small example, the collective silence, the failure to hold other journalists to account, is one of the sickest things about our press. It is, we don't want to be regulated properly. We don't want libel laws and privacy laws. And what's more, we don't want, we won't regulate ourselves. So there is absolutely no constraint here. It's rare indeed. It's very hard for anybody to sue. It's well known.
I'd just like to bring in Alison there. How would you respond to that? In terms of not enough journalists within the industry calling out other journalists, not being regulated properly.
I think I think there is more of that now than there used to be, and I think we have become sort of more perhaps fractured than we have been at any point in the past. And I think also I think that there is sort of a lot of things that are written about on social media that get huge amounts of sway and attention, that I think you have that kind of journalism that's taking place, because we have to, journalism is much wider than the sort of major established news brands. So there's a lot of people there in those situations. And there is the editor's code that does hold us to account. So in that situation, there are ways that we are, and we do have to account for what we're doing.
But I suppose people would say there hasn't been a single standards investigation by IPSO, even though there's been numerous, cases. So how strongly is the regulator holding journalists to account? Well, I mean, we still feel that we are strongly regulated. We felt that we are held to account, and we work within that editor's code, and we take it incredibly seriously. Nasreen, can I just bring you in here in terms of not speaking out? That's one thing you kind of touched upon before, but the other thing, Brian's kind of talked about the Times and some other kind of right-leaning newspapers and magazines. In terms of the left-leaning newspapers, is there space, because we'd see the left-leaning papers as being generally secular, liberal, is there space for Muslim voices that would be considered to be conservative, orthodox, and or is that kind of too much of a expectation to see other voices that don't fall in line with the accepted?
So first of all, I admire your optimism that there is a plurality of left-wing newspapers in the UK. I don't think that's a plural. I think that one of the problems that we have, and the sort of subtext of this entire discussion, is that there is a really unusual, even compared to other European countries, even the US, there's a really unusual right-wing skew in the British press, one that is not overt, and I'm sure the Times would deny that it has any ideological affiliation, which is one of the reasons that makes it even harder to have this conversation. So there isn't really that sort of balance, right versus left. Both right and left have the same amount of resources, the same amount of capital, and the same amount of reach. I write for The Guardian. I'm very proud to write for The Guardian when it comes to Islamophobia. I'm a columnist, and The Guardian has allowed me to bang on about this for about 10 years now. And it's something that, you know, I would consider myself one of those people. I am someone who is a practicing Muslim, who's also identified as Muslim. I'm from a Muslim country, and I do my best to, even when Brian was talking about the episode with the Times and Andrew Norfolk, to voice these issues in The Guardian, and they are heavily legaled. Like we go heavy on them, we take them to the legal advisors, we try and be responsible when we make these allegations. So I think that there definitely is space for people from Muslim backgrounds who don't subscribe to these sort of ideological world views, and that so that you don't have to be a secular Muslim. Basically, you don't have to be someone who has been completely shorn of your Muslim identity to get an airing. But we don't have that much space. We don't have that much real estate to write these rebuttals and to write these stories. So I think, to rephrase your question slightly, the issue isn't, is there space for more Muslim journalists in left-leaning newspapers in the UK? The question is there space to be a left-leaning newspaper in the UK and have that kind of reach and that kind of heft and that kind of support? And to be honest, the kind of impunity that I think a lot of these right-wing newspapers have. And I think one of the problems, I'm very keen to just widen out the perspective a little bit. I really hear what Alison's saying. I understand that newspapers are machines, and that the process of making news itself is very much a matter of rote, and things just slot into their place, and you're trying to push out the product all the time. And it can sometimes appear that Muslims are pleading for some sort of special exception to include these very specific processes just to treat Muslims with kid gloves so they don't come out, the stories don't come out a certain way. I'm sympathetic to that view, but I think the problem is that it's not just Muslims. You know, the problem is that it is an entire establishment, it's an entire machine, it's an entire way of producing the news that is quick, that looks for very specific hits on items. I think social media and the way the news is being disseminated, the way Facebook has cannibalized the news platforms, means that newspapers have to be more competitive and therefore more reductive in the way they present the news. And when you already have a sort of ideological affiliation or preference, or your readers have a certain worldview that you're trying to feed all the time so they continue to buy your product, then you will continuously skew more towards inaccurate, inflammatory reporting. And we've definitely seen that happen with the Times over the past 10 years, where the kind of sort of chasing the lucre of this sort of Islamic scare story. And I think that's one of the reasons why journalists like Andrew Norfolk are protected and defended. If we're going to be kind, not because there is somebody there saying, you know, we don't like Muslims and we're going to have a campaign internally to vilify them as much as possible. It is that these stories are well read, they are popular, and they make reputations. So I think we need to be a bit more realistic and a bit more sort of universal where Muslims are situated in the news-making industry. They are situated in a news-making industry, just to summarize, that is overwhelmingly right-leaning or right of center, with so many resources that go behind it, and a news industry that is under pressure, that is trying to feed its readers inflammatory stories that get them to consume, because the industry itself is under pressure to continue making a bottom line. And there's lots of competition. So there's also financial and ideological imperatives, and Muslims are just one group that are thrown into the crucible of that.
Faisal, I mean, one of our criteria, when we measure articles and analyze them, is due prominence, either given to Muslim voices or the kind of lack of due prominence given. What are your kind of observations on that? What comes across in both print and broadcast regarding Muslim voices?
I mean, there are Muslim voices present. Like you mentioned before, it depends on which voices are favored over others. And also, it's not just about voices. With due prominence, it's an issue of what kind of information, which particular information is retained in a report, and what information is actually omitted or not included, which would sort of clarify matters. And I can give you examples of really good practice in this. I mean, just to go back to the stuff Mark and Inzi were discussing about, when you get stories where you have a Muslim character and whether it's necessary to mention that they are Muslim. I mean, from a journalistic perspective, you practice journalism, I have. Sometimes that's unavoidable. And as Mark said, almost every occasion, it's arguable that it is unavoidable, because you have this individual who is a Muslim, who claims to be a Muslim. So you can't write that off. But there are ways in which journalists can sort of insert things within the material which would clarify matters. I'll give you an example. Recently, one of Inzi's colleagues on Sky News, Sadia Chowdhury, was reporting outside Manchester, I think a few weeks ago, maybe over a month ago actually, on a case of a Muslim individual who committed or was going to commit a terrorist act, who was caught, and he spoke about how he was, he wanted to do it for God, or he was something along those lines. Now, she read this out in front of the court where she was standing. She read this out because this was part of the transcript. What she did then was mention that actually none of this was sanctioned within his Islamic belief. And just that one sentence clarified the issue, to take it away from this sort of all Muslims are to blame for this kind of thing, or Islam is the motivating factor here. I'll give you another example where Sean O'Neill, who reports for The Times, did a piece on extremism within in prisons. And it was a perfectly decent story, but one of the things he mentioned, which hadn't been mentioned in previous reports on this issue, was when these guys would often shout the takbir, Allahu Akbar. And what he said, in a few words, he said, this is a cry that has been co-opted by terrorists, which mainstream Muslims, say numerous times a day within their prayers and outside of prayer. And again, just that line, it clarifies matters. And a lot of the time, journalists don't take that into consideration. But I think those small things are really, really important when it comes to prominence, because it's important in the sense that there are people who use these stories, even though they come from mainstream sort of publications and broadcasters, they weaponize these stories against Muslims. We've seen that. We've been on the receiving end of that as a sort of Muslim community and as individuals. And so even small things like that, I think, are useful. So in terms of due prominence, I think Inzi made a good point. The more Muslims in newsrooms, the sort of wider the network of sort of contacts that they can bring, and that would sort of widen the pool of not just in terms of the number of Muslim voices, but from which positions or which camps they sort of come from. Because at the moment, it's certain newspapers choose to have those people who like to throw other Muslims under the bus, to a different extent. But there's been people, for example, who have called for a war on Islam and Muslims, who have been featured in the right-wing or in the right-leaning publications, but recently in sort of left-leaning publications as well. And so that, I think, as long as that pool is widened and more sort of mainstream Orthodox Muslim voices come through, that's one way of sort of improving the situation.
Mark, if I could bring you in here. I mean, terrorism is probably one of the most difficult stories to cover. And Margaret Thatcher spoke about the oxygen of publicity that terrorists are given often, and you know, the choice of whether to amplify that, balanced with informing the public about what's happened. But often we find that in those situations, the kind of the extremist voice, and I touched on this before with you as well, that the extremist voice seems to take precedence, and platforms are given to kind of extremists and unrepresentative voices. How do you broaden that base of voices?
I don't quite know what you're referring to. I mean, I know the BBC takes enormous care not to give platforms to people who have unacceptable views on terrorism, and so I'm not quite sure what your point.
I mean, I think, you know, it's either, you know, we've found more recently kind of fringe voices like Anjum Chowdhury coming back into the news, but when you come to giving a platform, so Newsnight, a lot of, you know, Politics Today, a lot of the topical debate programs also tend to give platforms to far-right individuals, not just kind of Muslim extremists, but also far-right individuals without kind of proper challenge. And that in itself then has a repercussion in terms of, you know, how Muslims are viewed and what the consequences are for them. What checks and measures need to be in place when you are introducing fringe voices?
Yeah, I'm aware of the debate, and you'll understand if I'm not going to engage fully with that right now. But what I would say is that you know, it is one of the issues about the media is, and this is particularly true, I think, since people have been able to be in their own kind of media bubble, their social media bubble, if you like, is that we have become increasingly, put it another way, when one hears a view that you disagree with very strongly, it can feel almost like a physical assault. And when you hear a view that you agree with, it doesn't really have an awful lot of sort of physical or psychological impact. And one of the difficulties, I think, for the BBC is that when people hear something that they fundamentally disagree with, they see that as some sort of bias, or they see that as some sort of unfairness. You know, of course, there are arguments about exactly which voices should be heard when, whether prominence of this versus that. But I do think that is part of it. I'd like to ask you a question, or at least perhaps Faisal a question, which is about the word Muslim, because I'm now a bit confused as to what actually would constitute, you know, a sort of a good thing for us to do. Because on the one hand, you know, I do think it's difficult for us, as Faisal accepts, to cover. You know, I'm reaching for the words because having read your report, it's really hard to find any words to describe. But anyway, you know, terrorist incidents perpetrated by somebody who claims to be a Muslim. Let's put it that way. I'm trying to. Should we be using the word Muslim more often or less? For instance, should we be, if a female entrepreneur or a bus driver or anyone that we're talking to, or an expert that we bring on as an expert voice, should we be using the word Muslim more often, because that would broaden the sense of the different things that we're hearing from named Muslims, if you like, or should we be doing less of it?
Faisal?
Well, I think it's dependent on the publication that you work for and the approach they take. I mean, to give you an example, when I started with Center for Media Monitoring, we had a meeting with, if I can remember correctly, I think it was one of the Daily Mail's executive editors. And we spoke about the methodology that we were using. And one of the things he pointed out, I think he showed us a double page spread in the sort of business section. And they'd profiled a lady a Muslim lady who'd done really well in her career. She'd moved up and she was a high flyer, and they'd done a really good profile on her. And he said, the problem with your methodology is that, she wouldn't be included in that because there's no mention of her Muslim faith or Islamic identity, etc., etc. But the issue for us then was, okay, well, if you're going to use the word Muslim when so-called Muslims are committing, bad things or actions that are, everyone would agree are negative, why then not use them when they're doing something that's commendable or achieving great things?
But there's the issue, you see, is that as you have just acknowledged, with somebody who's as we've described, perverted relationship with Islam inspires them to commit acts of terror, it is entirely relevant to the story. The question then is, do we just sort of insert the word Muslim elsewhere, even when it's not relevant, when that person's faith is not relevant to the story we're telling? Because that would seem to me to be quite a dangerous approach if we're just sort of dropping the word in. That's my concern about this.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the concern, but I also think there's also other relevant factors. So, I mean, one of the things a lot of columnists are increasingly speaking about, in fact, somebody like Peter Hitchens has been banging on about it for years, is if you take all of these guys together, the guys who commit a terrorist act, what are the binding factors? When it comes to religion, a lot of them are losers. They're not well versed in religion. Most of them are, have spent lives on the streets as gangsters. They've got a macho attitude. Suddenly they've, entered into a sort of semi-religious place with other illiterates. And they've used, that combined with that macho attitude and mostly with drugs. A lot of them, or in fact, the majority, almost every single one of them is hooked on some major drug. That seems to be more of a binding factor than religion. So why not say, oh, he is another user of cannabis, or another loser who smokes these, incredibly mind-altering drugs and who's committed these actions. It simply depends on what you consider the binding factor. At the moment, it seems to me that everybody seems to, it seems to me that they want to say the binding factor here is Islam. It's, Muslim, it's the Muslim theology, etc., is responsible for this. What we're saying is, no, it's not. That's not the binding factor. There seem to be other factors. So, if you've got to get more serious about this. If you actually are very serious about it, there's a more sort of in-depth sort of study to do in terms of looking at what unites all these people.
I'm very conscious of the fact that we do have questions from the audience that I'd like to get in. Very briefly, before we go to questions from the audience, I think briefly, John and Brian, in terms of standards, what do you think needs to happen in terms of standards within journalism? Very briefly now, because we don't have that much time.
Well, I mean, shall I speak first? I would say that we need effective regulation, and I know Alison referred to IPSO, but it is not effective regulation. And a simple thing, as you pointed out, they never mount an investigation, but it's far worse than that. They have never, in 7 years, upheld a complaint about discrimination on grounds of race or religion. Never once in 7 years. And that is because there is a hole the size of a motor car in the code, which simply allows those things to happen. And I'm not being particularly critical about Alison here. In fact, I'd like to say that I think Alison has displayed much more, and not just today, much more thoughtfulness about these issues and a much greater seriousness and evidence of intent than I have ever heard from a British national newspaper editor in 20 years. I mean, she's to be commended for that. But Ipso is not going to deliver that. British journalism, British print journalism needs decent regulation, not state regulation, not censorship, but it needs independent regulation, like so many other people in so many other walks of life have. It's important because of the victims we've heard. We heard from Wajid earlier. But I mean, people should not be suffering like that. And I know, I mean, you know, my work, it puts me in contact with many, many people, some of whom are watching this evening, who have suffered as Wajid has suffered. It's appallingly cruel, and nothing is done about it. And we're told that Ipso is okay. It's not. And so we need better regulation, in short.
John?
Yes, I agree entirely. Better regulation and independent, properly independent of the organisation. So I would add Ofcom to Ipso as deficient in this regard. And I think one of the problems is the way in which it becomes difficult to bring forward criticisms and complaints through the processes internal to an organisation. And that creates the difficulty in approaching any external regulator. But I think it's a problem of British institutions, full stop, that so many of them have appropriated the right to mark their own homework.
And Insi, if you had one recommendation for your colleagues when reporting on Muslim issues, what would that be? Insaman, are you there?
Yeah, I am there. I'm also thinking. If I had one recommendation, you know, it's to the bosses, and that's to listen. That's to listen and to understand, to have an open mind and be prepared to adapt and to change. And you know, we've heard, you know, newsrooms are these, you know, big machines, and it's hard to kind of change your mindset overnight and all that stuff. But that can be done by the people you bring in, the talent pool that, you know, of people that you hire, and you know, listening to what new people, when they come in, and people from different backgrounds have got to add to the story. The example that Faisal you used, you know, about Sadia and her kind of background and knowledge of that story, that is the perfect example of having someone, whether they are on air, whether they are a producer, whether they are a news editor on the day, sat at the desk back in London, wherever, they you know, there will be a trigger or something in their mind, because it's lived experience for them to flag something to the reporter, to whoever needs to know that actually you'll need this caveat with that reporting. You know, you'll need that bit of extra line or bit of extra detail to go with it. And you know, I'd put it to yourself, Mark. You know, I don't know who you've worked with, but you know, have you, since being a Home Affairs editor for the BBC since 2004, you know, have you ever had a Muslim producer, or have you worked kind of, you know, with Muslims on big stories and then kind of gone, actually, yes, take stock, we hear that angle, and so we include that as well? Because it's
you're right. I mean, I absolutely take your point. I mean, diversity both within the newsroom and within our coverage is clearly critical, and it's critical to the BBC, and I'm sure it's critical to Sky too, in that we want to, you know, we genuinely want to understand. We need to understand in order that we can do what I said at the beginning is our primary purpose, which is to help people understand the world around them. And yes, of course, I'm sure you know, that there is ignorance and misunderstanding, and we get things wrong. And sometimes, as you suggest, you know, actually just put that line in, that would make a real difference. Is exactly what should happen. I want, you know, I want people on this call to know that we take this incredibly seriously and have done for a very long time. We talk about this kind of thing constantly, and our thought process is absolutely about how we can ensure, one, that we fulfill our journalistic obligation to tell stories properly and to explain them to people so they can understand them, but also to be truthful about the world around us. And that's, you know, there is often a disconnect between those two, that the agenda of stories that we cover doesn't paint a very true picture of the world. And that's not just an issue that affects Muslims. It's a problem that affects, you know, all kinds of groups. I won't go through it, but you can see what I mean. You get a distorted view of the world from just reading the newspaper or listening to the radio bulletin. And look, I found this a really, you know, valuable exercise. It's been really interesting to hear views. I think the report is full of, you know, challenging stuff and lots of things to take away. And you'll probably be glad to know that one of the people on the chat is going to come and chat to me about when we should use the word Muslim. We've DM'd each other, and so it's all ended happily.
Brilliant. Alison, if I'll just come to you, I'll take some of the questions here. Somebody has asked, Salma Hamid has said, how will this report be used? Will it change anything?
Yes, I think that's the short answer is definitely yes. And to that, I would add, I imagine Brian and I would constantly disagree on regulation, but I think what we really need to get to as an industry, and as I said earlier, we're not a homogenous thing, but as an industry, we've got to properly, fully regulate ourselves, and that requires really good training and really good cultures where people feel free to talk about where they see problems and how they feel those problems ought to be tackled with. So for that, we need true diversity in newsrooms, but then the opportunity, we actually need to change those cultures. So rather than waiting for somebody to come along with a big stick and tell us we've got something wrong 2 weeks down the line, we need to not be making those mistakes in the first place. And that you're only going to get through culture change. And by looking at reports such as this, and I've made loads of notes in my notebook during this about sort of specific bits of training I think we could introduce, and I will talk to other editors as well, and then I sort of think as an industry what we can all do to move forward, because we've got to keep moving.
Brilliant. There's one other one here, very quickly. Somebody talking about Dr. Jasit Singh saying, I'd like to know more about editorial processes around the representation of Muslims. How does a publication's ideological perspective, left or right-leaning, manifest itself in day-to-day decision-making? Are there any checks or balances? Is there anyone that would particularly like to tackle that one? Nazreen?
I'll tackle it very briefly and then someone else can have a go. I think, just to go back to what I said earlier, one of the problems is this lack of honesty about ideological leanings. I dare say that if you got any of the British big newspaper editors to sit there and say that they have an ideological leaning, then they'd say, no, we'll just report the news as it is. And I think one of the problems that we have in the British press, and I think in the sort of Anglo-American press in general, is this dishonesty and lack of reckoning with ideological world views. That's number one. Number two is there is a related solution to this question, which is one of the ways in which things can get better is if people understand and reckon with the fact that there are not only inbuilt biases, but overt ideological biases towards closed borders, less immigration, less racial diversity, culture war positions on history, on imperialism, on Black Lives Matter. These are all things, this is like a subtext to so much of British reporting that is actually dumped on the opinion pages. This is an important point. If you want to know what the sort of secret or unsaid ideological leaning of a paper is, look at the opinion pages, and then you might see what's happening in the news pages. Because if we're more honest about these things, then we can see news coverage in general and about Muslims in particular as part of a political worldview that is not necessarily related to real life. And that is fine. The first thing to do is to be honest about it. And then we can talk about how that is to be ameliorated. But to pretend that there is absolutely no lens through which these things is filtered is not only dishonest, it's an insult to the people who see this very clearly.
There's another question here. It kind of touches on something we were dealing with previously. I'm a lecturer at Oxford University, and I have the following question for the non-Muslim journalists on the panel. Why is the label Muslim relevant in crimes that are racialized as terrorism, while white Western crimes are not similarly racialized? Why is a Muslim's crime seen especially ideologically motivated, Islamist, but not the crimes of white Westerners, such as the Iraq War, something that has caused far more death and destruction? I mean, we did kind of touch on this, but I think it's this constant debate around when to mention Muslims, when not to mention Muslims. Is there anyone who'd like to pick up on that? Lindsay or
it's just
Brian?
It's just like you just report the news, you report what is there in front of you. If it but you report it with the knowledge as well, and that knowledge comes from, again, harking back to that idea of having those people around you that know the kind of particular issue. It's quite, look, it is difficult. I hold my hands up. It's so tough, and we are in a very kind of difficult situation where to say the right or wrong thing. But at the end of the day, you just report what the facts are, and you report it with sensitivity and knowledge that you get from whether you know something yourself or whether you have colleagues, producers, editors, whatever, who can inform you. And I think that's just it. It's a very common sense process at the end of the day.
It might be helpful just to recall where this comes from, which is, I mean, the origin of this debate and the origin, for example, of the editor's code element on this is about Black people and the reporting of crime in the 70s and 80s, and it became a routine that if a Black person committed a crime, it was pointed out that they were a Black person. And it was never pointed out when a white person committed a crime that they were white. And so, in a way, so many other things happen. The crimes became associated with the color. And that's how it began. And that's the kind of thing we've got to avoid. I mean, it's a crude way of addressing the issue, but it seems to me relevant.
I know we were supposed to stop at 9. Can we just, if all the panelists agree, just give it a kind of 5 more minutes? I know it's very late, or would you particularly like to stop? Just a couple more questions and then I'll let you go. This one again is quite similar, but could you talk a little about the role of standards and regulation in tackling Islamophobia specifically?
It's one thing I just want to point out, that broadcast is regulated a whole load differently to print. Like the difference is huge, and I think it's it's hugely important to point out. And again, we come back to quite a similar discussion where the media is kind of branded under this one umbrella, but the differences between broadcast and print are stark. And there's been times where I've had kind of Muslim friends and family of mine kind of contact me saying, why on earth are you not covering this, or why has this publication covered it this way? And at the end of the day, people, different kind of, the papers and broadcasts do things completely differently, and it's so hard to kind of then defend the media as a whole when it's kind of all put under this one umbrella. So when it comes to regulation, I think it's important to note that there are two completely different ways of regulating it.
Indeed, and I mean, if I could add that broadcast, and I know that there are some problems about the way Ofcom operates, but broadcast is regulated much more aggressively by Ofcom than IPSO regulates the press, and one of the consequences of that is that our broadcasters are far more trusted than our newspapers. I mean, simply far more trusted. They're in a different league.
I think I'd like to kind of just give the final word to Wajid, actually, as a victim of misrepresentation and misreporting and inaccuracy. Wajid, what would be your kind of plea to newspaper editors, journalists, when it comes to reporting on Muslims like yourself?
I mean, I've just sent you a message. It's more about education. And look, well, obviously the investigation they have to do, make sure it's right. And mentioning, I've been listening, especially when Mark saying, when should he mention, the word Muslim? Why do you need to mention the word Muslim? You don't do it for anything else, but why does it have to be for when, all right, okay, say a Muslim does commit an offence or act of terror, like Faisal said, you won't need to generalise them in terms of their religious background, because personally, as a Muslim, if somebody says, oh, I'm doing it in the name of Islam, they're not. Just like, I mean, a few weeks ago with that Liverpool guy, initially they reported they said it was Muslim, and then obviously it came out that he'd reverted to Christianity, and it soon died a death. But if that had been a Muslim, it had been reported a lot more. And I think everyone agrees, it's not just myself, and it's speaking with the wider community, the Muslim and Muslims throughout the UK, they feel they're targeted by the media. And the media will say, oh, we're not doing it. It's clear. We're not mourning constantly, but it's there. It's, obviously in terms of CSE, child sexual exploitation, I know there's grooming gangs out there, and they've been found guilty, but it's like when I've been on training courses, and this figure was given by the police, that 80% of groomers are white. It's just that 20% are non-white, and the gangs. So that's why it gets focused. That the Muslims, I mean, like I said yesterday to the BBC, you didn't see the media reporting that Jimmy Savile was a white Christian. It was a groomer, full stop. And just like with these grooming gangs, they're just groomers. There's no need to portray their background. So it's more about education. It starts from the top. When you've got the likes of the Prime Minister referring to Muslim women as letterboxes and refuses to apologise, I see it that members of the public out there and the media might think, well, the Prime Minister can say it and get away with it without the need to apologise. It must be the norm. Politicians have a part to play in this. The media, these are two critical types of people that the wider public listen to. And if they're banging on about Islamic bad or Muslims have done this, then Joe public out there, will just listen to these politicians and media people.
Thank you, Wajid. I mean, I think there's, a lot to take away from today's discussions, whether it's to do with consistency of how you report on communities, the kind of identification of Muslims when sometimes it's not relevant, the question of where is that relevance and when should it be mentioned, in terms of the narratives and the tropes that exist, in terms of the kind of general levels of misrepresentation, but also what needs to be done and what needs to be done in terms of regulation, as well as internally within each media organization, what they need to do. And we've seen that there are things that are happening at various outlets. But I think the important thing about today is that it's a conversation, and Centre for Media Monitoring has lots and lots of conversations like this with lots of people, you know, from the media, regulators, as well as policymakers and community organisations. And I think we have to keep this conversation going, because there's enough evidence out there to show that how Muslims and Islam are reported on differs from how other communities are reported on. And for the outgoing chair of IPSO to say that, it's a pity he didn't say it when he was in the position, but he did say it. And there's lots of other evidence, whether it's, you know, Cambridge University's report or Leicester University's report, which both say that the reporting of Muslims and Islam in mainstream media is contributing to growing hostility and hate crimes. There's a body of evidence there that suggests that there is a problem. And it's been really interesting and useful to speak to all the kind of journalists and editors here who've recognized that and who've begun this conversation. And we can only hope that we continue this and slowly we begin to see some change within the media, because it has real life impact on human beings, ordinary human beings, as Wajid has explained. And he hasn't gone into the details of how much it impacted on his life. And it's not just Wajid, it's women daily being abused in the street for physically looking like Muslims and wearing hijabs. It's people being denied jobs because of Muslim sounding names or interviews. It's children in schools being abused and called terrorists or being physically abused. So these have wide-ranging impact on British citizens. And I think that the media, as a very kind of powerful institution, needs to use its power very responsibly, needs to be held to account, but we need to work together in order to improve this. I'd like to thank everybody, both kind of on the panel, guest speakers, behind the scenes. There's a number of people who've been minding the back end, Faisal for having written the report, Zara, Mikdad, constant support, and the audience. I'm sorry we weren't able to take as many of your questions, but I hope that I saw a lot of the questions actually, you know, had been covered within the discussions. But thank you all for taking part. Beginning of a conversation, inshallah, we'll continue with this. Thank you very much. Good night and assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone.